There are 54 countries on the African continent, but do you know why the borders are drawn straight? That is because 100 years ago, European countries took the liberty of drawing lines based on latitude and longitude on a map when they took control of Africa. During this period, most of Africa was colonized by European countries. However, there is one such country that did not become a European colony. It is Ethiopia, located in the northeastern part of the African continent. Why were Africans unable to resist European invasion? Why was Ethiopia alone able to repel the European invasion? The first and second halves of this two-part series will look back at the history of colonial rule from an African perspective. Hello everyone, my name is Kanta. I have often covered African history on my channel, but one thing that has left a significant impact on Africa even today is the European colonial rule that took place in the 19th and 20th centuries. A colony is a territory that a politically or economically powerful superpower has established for the purpose of expropriating land, crops, resources, or raw materials for its own benefit. During the 19th and 20th centuries, most parts of Africa succumbed before the power of European countries and became colonies. In the midst of all this, there are only two countries that were not colonized: Ethiopia in the northeastern part of Africa and Liberia in the western part of Africa. However, Liberia was founded by freed black slaves from the United States of America and was essentially a protectorate of the United States. Therefore, it can be said that Ethiopia was the only country in Africa that did not become a European colony. This issue is in two parts, the first half and the second half. The first half will review the history of European colonization of Africa, and the second half will explain why Ethiopia did not become a European colony. Please watch both the first half and the second half to the end. First, we turn to Europe, which is about 250 to 200 years old. From the mid-18th century to the early 19th century, the large factory system using machinery and steam engines became widespread in England and other European countries, beginning with technological innovations in the cotton industry. During this period, people who had lived in rural areas began to flow into urban areas, becoming factory workers, and large-scale factory production began to take place. As a result of the major changes in the social structure, the productive forces have increased dramatically, and the center of the economy has been transformed from agriculture to industry. This set of social changes is called the Industrial Revolution. Incidentally, although this is a digression from the main topic of this issue, the driving force behind the Industrial Revolution was the enormous amount of money accumulated through the Atlantic Triangular Trade, the so-called slave trade, which had been conducted during the previous era. While I won't go into detail this time, I plan to cover the period before European colonial rule in Africa in a separate video. European countries require large amounts of resources and raw materials for large-scale factory production. The continent of Africa was rich in resources and raw materials. For example, oil palms that grew in the Niger River Basin in Western Africa, and groundnuts from the area where Senegal and Gambia are located today, were able to produce lubricating oil to run factory machines and trains. In order to obtain these resources and raw materials in Africa, European countries were the first to send expeditions to Africa, and they advanced into the interior of the African continent, which had been previously uncharted territory. European explorers who established bases along the coast of the African continent first began their expeditions by seeking the sources of the great rivers that flowed through the regions: the Niger River in Western Africa, the Congo River in Central Africa, the Zambezi River in Southern Africa, and the Nile River flowing from Eastern to Northern Africa. Explorers in search of the headwaters of the great rivers in various parts of the African continent entered the interior of Africa, and as soon as they reached the land, they discovered it for the first time and gave it the name of their country. For example, British explorer David Livingstone, who embarked on an expedition to find the source of the Zambezi River, discovered a huge waterfall that the locals called Mosi Oatunya, meaning the smoke that thunders, and named it Victoria Falls, after the reigning Queen of England. There are many place names in Africa that, like Victoria Falls, are derived from European names. For example, in Uganda, East Africa, where I have been involved in international cooperation activities, there is Murchison Falls National Park, named after Roderick Murchison, then President of the Royal Geographical Society of England. European explorers who ventured as far as the interior of Africa, upon reaching the land, promised to protect it by giving gifts of money and goods to the local authorities. Once local authorities entered into treaties for protection, those regions fell under the sphere of influence of the explorers' respective countries. In this context, protection may sound more agreeable, but essentially it means being subjected to European domination. In this way, European nations sent successive expeditions into Africa, entered into protection treaties with local leaders across various regions, and thereby asserted their own claims of sovereignty. Of course, there were originally indigenous African locals living in those lands, with various ethnic groups coexisting. The relationships and distributions among these ethnic groups were disregarded, and African borders were drawn according to the arbitrary convenience of the Europeans. For example, supported by King Leopold II of Belgium during that time. Explorer Stanley undertook an exploration of the Congo River Basin in Central Africa from 1879. He established 40 bases across various regions and entered into 400 protection treaties with local leaders. As a result, despite the vast land being approximately 70 times the size of Belgium, the entire Congo became the personal property of King Leopold II of Belgium. During the subsequent Congo Free State period, local people were subjected to harsh forced labor in the extraction of natural rubber, leading to a tragic era in which 10 million people lost their lives. At the outset of European explorations, the lands of Africa were essentially open for unrestricted exploitation by European whites. Given such circumstances, European countries convened international conferences aimed at the orderly partitioning of Africa. Well, the term orderly partitioning of Africa already sounds odd, doesn't it? The conference that took place from 1884 to 1885 is known as the Berlin Conference. During this era, European countries that sought to colonize the Congo region were in conflict with each other. Fearing that this could escalate into war, German Chancellor Bismarck called for the Berlin Conference to mediate these disputes. 13 countries that sought to colonize Africa participated in the Berlin Conference. Held in Berlin, Germany, far from Africa, it was there that European nations gathered and divided the African continent, marking the beginning of full-fledged colonial rule. The Berlin Conference established the fundamental principles for the colonization of Africa. For example, the principle of the sphere of influence. This principle stated that occupying coastal areas automatically conferred ownership of the inland territories behind them. Kenyan historian Ogot described the Berlin Conference, which ignored the presence of Africans who originally lived there, in the following way. There is no precedent in world history for nations from one continent to brazenly gather and justify the partition and occupation of another continent in such a manner. The Berlin Conference accelerated European colonial domination over Africa, leading to a significant increase in colonial control after its conclusion. Over the 30 years from 1880 to 1910, the vast African continent was divided by European nations, with most of it becoming colonies. In 1912, with Italy's acquisition of Libya, the entire African continent, except for Liberia and Ethiopia, was divided and controlled by just 7 European countries. The 7 countries that dominated Africa were Britain, France, Belgium, Germany, Italy, Portugal, and Spain. Among these, Britain and France had the greatest influence. On this map, the areas in red were controlled by Britain, and the areas in blue were controlled by France. This shows that a large portion of the African continent was under the control of these 2 countries. Why were European countries able to control the African continent, which is several times larger than their own countries, in such a short period? Conversely, why were African people unable to resist European colonial rule? I will focus on 3 reasons. Why were African countries unable to resist European control? The first reason is the overwhelming military power of the Europeans. While African people were still fighting with bows and arrows and spears, Europeans were using advanced weaponry such as the Gatling gun, a rapid-firing heavy machine gun. For example, in the battle between the Kingdom of Dahomey in West Africa and the French army, the Dahomey side suffered over 5,000 casualties, while the French army had only 77 casualties. By the way, some might wonder about an even more fundamental question. Why were Europeans able to develop advanced weapons before Africans? Regarding this question, Jared Diamond's book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, provides valuable insights. If you are interested, please also read Guns, Germs, and Steel. Let's return to the topic of why Europe was able to colonize Africa. The second reason why Europe was able to colonize Africa is the existence of the malaria treatment quinine. At that time, the bark of the cinchona tree was considered an effective treatment for malaria. This tree grew in Peru, South America. According to legend, someone suffering from malaria and extremely thirsty due to the high fever drank the bitter water collected at the base of a cinchona tree. Miraculously, the fever began to subside, leading to the discovery of the tree's medicinal properties. It was European missionaries who had visited South America during the Age of Exploration who brought the bark of the cinchona tree back to Europe. They powdered the bark and used it as a remedy for malaria, referring to it at the time as Jesuits' powder. The active ingredient in the bark was quinine. Europeans who drank beverages containing quinine, such as tonic water and gin and tonic, became less susceptible to malaria. This reduced susceptibility allowed them to establish and maintain colonial rule in malaria-prone regions of Asia and Africa. Following this, Europe saw advancements in science and technology against the backdrop of the Industrial Revolution. In 1820, French researchers succeeded in isolating the active ingredient from the cinchona tree. From then on, malaria was treated not with powdered cinchona bark, but with quinine crystals. Thus, the development of an effective treatment for malaria, an infectious disease in Africa backed by scientific and technological progress, further advantaged European colonization efforts. For example, during battles, while African people were rapidly succumbing to malaria and their forces were being depleted by caring for the sick, Europeans, who had developed a treatment for malaria, were able to prevent the disease. This allowed them to gain an advantage over the African forces. We have examined the first reason, which is the overwhelming military power of Europe, and the second reason, which is the existence of an effective treatment for malaria. Finally, let's look at the third reason from the perspective of Africa, to understand why Africa was defeated. Why were African countries unable to resist European control? There was also a reason on the side of Africa for their defeat by Europe. The African people were unable to unite and collectively resist European control. Africa is a region with diverse ethnic groups, languages, cultures, and religions. The unique histories, cultures, and interests of these different ethnic groups made it difficult for African people to unite and fight against European forces. The slave trade, which was taking place in Africa before the start of European colonial rule, also influenced this ethnic diversity. During the era of the slave trade, European slave traders supplied powerful kingdoms and leaders who were cooperative and submissive with guns and ammunition. These groups then attacked other ethnic groups to capture slaves in what were called slave raids. As a result of these slave raids, villages that once traded or formed alliances with each other began to fracture. People started forming smaller groups to protect themselves, but these small groups never developed into large communities or states. In regions affected by the slave trade, the emergence of large communities or states was hindered, leading to extremely fragmented areas divided by ethnicity. As a result, it became difficult for African people to unite and collectively resist European colonial rule. Furthermore, the European powers cleverly exploited the ethnic diversity of Africa to strengthen their control by inciting conflicts and rivalries. The Europeans at that time formed alliances with specific ethnic groups, granting them privileges or regional control, thereby creating imbalances among the African people. Under such circumstances, it was not easy for the African people to unite and resist European domination. The methods used by Europeans to conquer Africa were similar in different regions. In other words, they demanded that the local rulers cede their sovereignty to the European countries in exchange for the protection of their political power. The African people had no choice. If they defied the Europeans, they would be subdued by force. Some Africans did resist, but most of them were defeated by the overwhelming military power of the Europeans. However, there was one country that won the war against European invasion and never became a colony: Ethiopia. Why was Ethiopia able to resist European invasion? What path did Ethiopia follow after avoiding colonization? I will explain this in detail in the latter half of the video. In the second half, I will take a comprehensive look back at the modern history of Ethiopia. By the way, those familiar with world history might argue, but Ethiopia was also an Italian colony for a short period. I will address that point in the latter half of the video, so please stay tuned. My channel explains various issues in the world that are difficult to learn about through other channels. It is important not to be interested, but to stay interested. Please subscribe to my channel to stay interested. Thank you again for watching this video to the end. See you again in the next video.